Celeste Marlowe had learned to glide through Ashford Manor without leaving a trace. Yet the moment Sterling Ashford's voice cut across the marble foyer, her invisibility shattered. For years, she had trained herself to move quietly enough that the sound of her steps was swallowed by the thick rugs to keep her head lowered so her presence blurred into the periphery of the grand rooms. Yet that morning, when Sterling called her name in front of 3 impeccably dressed guests, the air in the foyer seemed to sharpen. The last time a man's voice had startled her in such a way was years ago, in a very different room, where the only light came from a piano lamp, and her mother's thin hand had rested on her shoulder. "Promise me you'll never stop playing," her mother had whispered. Celeste had promised. And for a time she kept it until grief hollowed her out, and the keys felt like strangers under her fingers. The grand estate stood just beyond Boston's old money district, the late autumn sky pale and streaked with cloud. Thin sunlight filtered through the mullioned windows, striping the polished oak floor with gold. Celeste had been at work since dawn, already in the east wing dusting the grand salon. The faint scent of lemon oil hung in the air, mingling with the ghost of last night's fire in the marble hearth. Sterling Ashford loomed in the foyer, his tailored navy suit absorbing the light, silver hair gleaming. His smile was thin, his voice carrying the tone of a man who expected the world to listen. "Miss Marlowe," he said, drawing the eyes of his guests to her. "You play piano, don't you?" She paused, duster in hand, careful not to reveal more than necessary. "A little, sir." Sterling's smile widened into something almost performative. "Perfect. We must have a bit of entertainment for the gala next month. What better than our own staff showing their talents? You'll play a piece after dinner." From the sweeping staircase came the click of heels, then Lydia Ashford's voice, polished and amused. "Father, what a charming idea," she said as she descended, her silk dress whispering around her ankles. She turned to Celeste with a look that glittered like ice. "Something short and sweet, I think. Nothing too ambitious?" The guests chuckled politely. Celeste's jaw tightened. Refusal here would be defiance, and defiance had consequences. She inclined her head. "If that's what you wish, sir." The exchange passed quickly for the guests, but for Celeste, the moment lingered like a bruise. She excused herself to the grand salon, trying to focus on her work. The room stretched wide, its high ceilings adorned with crown molding, its walls lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors, staring down with imperious calm. It was in that stillness that she heard the notes of a piano from the far side of the house, hesitant and uneven. She followed the sound to the music room doorway. A hired entertainer sat at the Steinway, running through a polite waltz with indifferent skill. Celeste's fingers curled slightly against her palm, a reflex she could not control. Even after years of silence, her muscles remembered the feel of octaves, the reach of a perfect chord. She stepped back before anyone could notice her. In the hallway, Harriet Cole appeared, her apron crisp, her expression unreadable. "Early start today," Harriet remarked. Celeste managed a small smile. "I wanted to finish the East Wing before the art movers arrive." Harriet handed her a fresh set of polishing cloths. "Keep your wits about you. Around here, an invitation is often just another kind of test." Through the rest of the morning, the manor buzzed with activity florists bringing in white roses, caterers taking inventory in the kitchen, a lighting crew testing the crystal chandeliers. Celeste moved quietly among them, efficient and invisible again. But the earlier exchange kept replaying in her mind. Near midday, she crossed paths with Sterling once more. He was walking the art dealers toward the grand salon, gesturing toward a bare wall where a new piece would be displayed. He noticed her again and, almost as an afterthought, said, Something classical, Miss Marlowe. Keep it tasteful." She nodded, retreating to the service corridor. Her heart pounded not from fear, but from the dangerous stirring of something she had buried long ago. By the time the staff gathered for their afternoon break in the kitchen, Lydia had made her way there too, a rare visit to the servants' domain. She leaned against the marble counter, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup. "I do hope you're not nervous about performing," she said sweetly to Celeste. "It's just for fun, a little moment to amuse our friends." Celeste kept her tone even. "Of course, Miss Ashford." Lydia's lips curved in a smile that did not touch her eyes. "Good. We wouldn't want anyone to take themselves too seriously." She set down the cup and swept from the room, her perfume lingering in the warm air. When the day's duties were finished, Celeste stepped out into the crisp evening, the light fading to a dusky blue over the estate grounds. Her small apartment above a corner grocery in Cambridge was a world away from Ashford Manor's grandeur. She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment in the quiet. In the corner, a leather case lay beneath the narrow bed. She pulled it out, brushing the dust from its surface before unlatching it. Inside were yellowed sheets of music, their edges curled, and a photograph of a younger Celeste standing beside a tall, smiling man with a trumpet slung over his shoulder, Louis Jennings. Her fingers traced the photo's worn edge. The memory of his voice came back clearly. "Play what they don't expect, and they'll remember you forever." She placed the photograph on the table and sat down, the silence of the room pressing close. As she turned toward the kitchen to put the kettle on, Lydia's parting words from the morning returned to her bright, mocking, and deliberate. As she turned away, Lydia murmured to a friend, "We'll see how long the Maid lasts under the lights." The morning broke with the brittle chill of late November, frost threading across the windows of Ashford Manor like fine lace. Celeste arrived earlier than usual, the hum of her breath visible in the air as she stepped from the service entrance into the still dark kitchen. She moved quietly, not yet ready to face the eyes and voices that would inevitably turn toward her as the day unfolded. She thought of the conversation in her apartment the night before, with Harriet on the phone. Harriet had been brief, but her words stuck. Sometimes the Ashfords ask for one thing when they really want another. "Play carefully, Celeste." That was Harriet's way, more warning than comfort. Today's work was supposed to be simple. Prepare the music room for the arrival of a rare antique cabinet Sterling had purchased at auction. The room already smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood, the Steinway gleaming under a dust cover. Celeste removed the cover, the piano's black lacquer reflecting the pale light creeping through the curtains. She pressed a single key, letting the note ring through the room, and felt the vibration deep in her chest. By mid-morning, the household began to stir. Lydia appeared in a tailored wool coat, her hair pulled back with an elegance that seemed calculated. She carried a leather-bound notebook under her arm, flipping through it as if it contained state secrets. "Father wants the cabinet positioned by the west wall," she said, without looking up. "And the piano, closer to the windows, better light for photographs." Celeste inclined her head and began moving the piano with careful precision. As she worked, she caught fragments of Lydia's conversation with a man in the doorway, Maxwell Dorrance, an art dealer who had been circling the Ashfords for months. His low voice carried a hint of urgency. "The piece coming in today is worth more than most of your father's collection combined. Make sure it stays in the family." The words lodged in Celeste's mind. She knew that "stays in the family" rarely meant what it sounded like. Around here, it could mean locking something away, keeping it out of sight until its value was needed, or hiding it entirely from those who might have a rightful claim. The delivery arrived just before noon. Two men carried in the mahogany cabinet, its surface etched with intricate vines and birds, its brass handles dulled with age. Celeste directed them to the west wall, feeling Lydia's gaze on her the entire time. When the movers left, Lydia crossed the room, her fingertips brushing the wood as though it might reveal a secret to her alone. "Father says this belonged to a branch of the family we no longer associate with," Lydia said, almost idly. "Imagine what stories it could tell." Celeste kept her face neutral, but something in her tightened. She had seen enough in this house to know that objects often carried more truth than the people who claimed them. The rest of the afternoon passed in small, deliberate tasks, dusting the portrait frames, checking the silver in the dining room, setting out fresh arrangements of calla lilies. But in her mind, Celeste kept returning to that cabinet. It stood too tall and too proud to be merely decorative. When Sterling returned home early from a meeting, he found Celeste in the music room, adjusting the height of the piano bench. He lingered in the doorway. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "I trust you've begun practicing for the gala." "Yes, sir," she replied, though her voice was careful, almost clipped. His smile was quick, but there was weight in his tone when he added, "Remember, you're here because we choose to keep you here." It wasn't a threat in words, but the implication was clear enough. That night, as most of the staff finished and left, Celeste returned to the music room under the pretext of wiping down the keys. The rest of the manor was hushed, the sound of the wind rattling the windows faint in the distance. She approached the cabinet, running her fingertips along the edge where wood met brass. One handle was cooler to the touch than the other. She tried it gently, but it wouldn't move. Kneeling, she noticed faint scratches around the lock, fresh ones. Someone had been here before her. The thought came unbidden. If something in here could change the way this family sees itself. She pushed it away, standing quickly as footsteps echoed in the hall. Harriet's familiar shape filled the doorway, her face unreadable. "You'll want to leave that be, Celeste," Harriet said softly. "Some doors, once opened, never close again." Celeste's pulse quickened, but she only nodded, stepping back from the cabinet. Harriet lingered a moment longer, her eyes flicking to the brass handles before she turned away. Alone again, Celeste sat at the piano, letting her hands rest lightly on the keys. She played a single, low chord that seemed to reverberate through the quiet house. In the reflection on the lacquer, the cabinet loomed behind her, its locked doors glinting faintly in the dim light. In that moment, she knew she could not ignore it much longer. The wind rattled the window panes again, but this time it sounded almost like a whisper, as if the house itself was urging her to look inside. The first snow of the season had fallen overnight, muting the estate's long drive under a blanket of white. From the second-floor window, Celeste watched the staff salt the stone steps, their movements brisk against the cold. In the glass, her own reflection hovered, a faint ghost beside the sprawling grounds. She remembered Harriet's warning from the day before, the way her eyes had lingered on the cabinet as if it were a wound that might reopen. Today was not a day for quiet contemplation. The Ashfords were hosting a luncheon for the trustees of the local historical society, and Sterling had insisted every inch of the manor gleam. Celeste moved through the main hallway, noting the portraits that lined the walls' faces of Ashford's past, their eyes painted with a mix of pride and calculation. She paused at one near the dining room. A young woman in a high-necked gown, her expression both serene and unreadable. Lydia's resemblance to her was unmistakable. In the dining room, Lydia stood with a crystal decanter in hand, instructing a footman on the precise placement of the wine glasses. Her tone was cool, but her gaze flicked toward Celeste with something almost like curiosity. "Make sure the music room is off limits today," she said, her voice low enough that only Celeste could hear. "We can't have guests wandering into places they shouldn't." Celeste nodded, though the words deepened the pull she felt toward the locked cabinet. The sense that something was being guarded not for protection, but for concealment, was becoming impossible to ignore. The luncheon began promptly at noon. Sterling, at the head of the table, spoke with the polished ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. Lydia charmed the trustees with practiced smiles, while Maxwell Dorrance lingered at her elbow, slipping in whispered remarks between courses. Celeste served wine and cleared plates, moving unnoticed through the room, but her attention was caught by a fragment of their conversation. "If the provenance were known, it could complicate things," Maxwell murmured. "Which is precisely why it mustn't be," Lydia replied without hesitation. By the time the guests moved to the parlor for coffee, Celeste had pieced together enough to know they were speaking about the cabinet. The idea of provenance proof of origin suggested not just value, but history. And history in this house was rarely simple. As the trustees admired the grand piano in the parlor, Sterling excused himself to take a call in his study. Moments later, Lydia also slipped away, leaving Maxwell to entertain the remaining guests. Celeste seized the opportunity, retreating toward the music room under the guise of checking the windows. The room was as she had left it, save for a faint shift in the air, as if someone had been here recently. She approached the cabinet, crouching to inspect the lock again. This time she noticed a hairline gap at the base of one door, small enough to escape casual notice, wide enough to suggest it hadn't been closed properly. She reached for the handle. A voice behind her stopped her cold. "Looking for something, Miss Marlowe?" Sterling stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his phone still in hand. The warmth of his earlier hosting had vanished, replaced by a careful neutrality that felt far more dangerous. "I was making sure the windows were secure," Celeste said evenly, forcing herself to step back. He walked into the room, his gaze sweeping over the piano, the lilies, and finally the cabinet. Resting a hand on its top, he said, "Some things in this house have been here longer than either of us. They stay closed for a reason." The words might have ended the moment, but Sterling lingered, his fingers tapping once against the wood before he left as suddenly as he had appeared. That evening, when the house had settled into its usual hush, Celeste sat at the piano, her back to the cabinet. She let her hands drift over the keys, the melody soft but persistent, as if coaxing something unseen to the surface. In the dim light, the reflection of the cabinet shimmered faintly in the lacquered lid. For the first time, she thought she saw the outline of a folded document inside, just visible through the gap in the door. Her breath caught, and she stopped playing. The sound of the final note faded into the quiet, leaving only the awareness that whatever was inside had been waiting, perhaps, for her. She reached toward the cabinet again, her fingertips brushing the cool brass, when the distant creak of a floorboard reminded her she was not alone in this house. The wind howled against the eaves that night, rattling the old windows as if the house itself were restless. Downstairs, the embers in the library fireplace threw shifting shadows across the walls, and Celeste sat alone in one of the high-backed chairs, the faint crackle of burning wood filling the silence. She kept replaying Sterling's words in her mind, "Things stay closed for a reason." It was a warning, but also an admission, and the more she turned it over, the more it felt like an invitation disguised as caution. Earlier in the day, she had overheard Lydia speaking on the phone in the solarium, her voice low but tight. The name Dorrance surfaced twice, along with a mention of documents and timing. When Lydia ended the call abruptly upon seeing Celeste, the air between them had been taut enough to snap. That conversation, coupled with Sterling's sudden appearance in the music room, had confirmed what Celeste already sensed. Whatever was inside that cabinet was more than a piece of family history. It was leverage. Now, in the library's dim light, she opened the small leather journal Harriet had quietly slipped into her pocket after the luncheon. Its cover was cracked, the pages brittle, and the handwriting spidery but elegant. The entries, dated more than 4 decades ago, were signed with a single initial E. They spoke of debts, secret meetings, and a sum of money exchanged for silence. One entry, in particular, stopped her. The cabinet is not just storage, it is protection. Until the truth can be faced without ruin, it must remain locked. Celeste's mind raced. If the truth could ruin the Ashfords, then the question was who it would ruin most, and who might stand to gain from it. The next afternoon brought a thick, wet snow that clung to the trees. The family gathered in the dining room for an early supper, the windows fogging slightly from the warmth inside. Sterling carved roast lamb with practiced precision. Lydia sipped her wine in a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, and Maxwell made small talk about the Historical Society's next gala. Harriet moved quietly between them, her expression giving nothing away. Midway through the meal, Lydia set down her glass and looked directly at Celeste. "You've been exploring the house, haven't you? I hope you're not the type to mistake curiosity for entitlement." The words were soft, but the challenge in them was unmistakable. Celeste met her gaze evenly. "I'm here to do my job well, Mrs. Ashford. If that involves understanding the house, then yes, I've looked around." Sterling's knife paused mid-slice, his eyes flicking briefly between them before resuming the cut. Maxwell chuckled under his breath, though it lacked any real amusement. Harriet kept pouring water, her hands steady. After supper, the group drifted to the drawing room. The snow outside thickened, muting the world beyond the windows. Celeste lingered near the doorway, waiting for the moment when the others' attention would turn inward. It came when Lydia began playing the piano, her long fingers coaxing a low, sonorous melody from the keys. Sterling stood at her side, humming along. Maxwell poured himself another drink. Celeste slipped into the hall, her steps light on the runner. The music room was dark, the only illumination a faint silver glow from the snow outside. She approached the cabinet again, the memory of the journal entry urging her forward. The hairline gap was still there. She reached into her pocket for the thin set of picks she kept not for theft, but for the practical reality that old locks often needed coaxing. The sound of the pins shifting was nearly imperceptible over the piano's muffled chords. Then came the soft click of the latch releasing. Her pulse hammered as she eased the door open. Inside, beneath a folded wool shawl, was a bundle of documents tied with faded ribbon. She had just begun to lift it when the reflection in the glass door caught her eye, a figure standing behind her, silent, unmoving. "You really don't know when to leave well enough alone, do you?" The voice was Maxwell's, his tone low and edged with something that wasn't quite anger, but was far from calm. The snow had turned to an icy rain by morning, tapping steadily against the leaded windows of the breakfast room. Celeste sat at the far end of the table, nursing a cup of coffee gone lukewarm, her mind replaying the moment she had turned to find Maxwell in the music room doorway. He had said nothing more after his pointed remark, only stepped aside to let her pass, his expression unreadable. But the weight of that encounter lingered, heavy as the winter sky. Maxwell entered now, dressed in a charcoal suit, though there was nowhere to go in such weather. He moved with the unhurried assurance of someone who had been raised to believe that rooms would bend to his presence. "Sterling wants to see you in the study," he said, without looking directly at her, then took a seat and began peeling an orange with meticulous care. The faint citrus scent rose into the air, oddly at odds with the tension settling between them. In the study, Sterling stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. The rain streaked the glass, distorting the bare trees beyond. "I understand you've been curious," he began, his voice as measured as the ticking of the mantel clock. "Curiosity can be admirable, but in this house it can also be dangerous." Celeste met his gaze, unflinching. "Dangerous to whom?" He regarded her for a long moment before turning away, as though the answer lay somewhere in the gray morning beyond the glass. "That depends on what you're looking for." He gestured to a chair. "Sit." The conversation unfolded like a chess match, careful, deliberate, with each side revealing just enough to keep the other guessing. Sterling asked about her work, about her impressions of the family, about the journal she had been seen carrying. She answered selectively, aware that every word would be weighed. Later that afternoon, Harriet found her in the butler's pantry, where the faint aroma of polish and old wood lingered. Harriet's eyes flicked toward the corridor to ensure they were alone. "Whatever you do," she murmured, "don't let them turn you against each other. That's how they survive." She slipped a folded piece of paper into Celeste's hand before disappearing down the hall. In the privacy of her room, Celeste unfolded it to reveal a faded photograph, two young men in suits, one of them unmistakably Sterling, the other a stranger with the same sharp jawline and eyes that mirrored his own. On the back, in a careful script, was written Harbor Point, August 1973. The photograph became an anchor in her thoughts as evening fell. She carried it with her to dinner, tucking it into her coat pocket. The meal was quieter than the night before, the only sound the faint chime of silverware against china. Lydia asked after the accounts. Sterling spoke briefly about repairs to the West Wing, and Maxwell contributed a few dry observations about the weather. Beneath the surface, currents shifted. Celeste could feel it, like the subtle pull of a tide. After dinner, as the others settled in the drawing room, Celeste made her way to the third-floor landing, where the rain had eased into a mist. From here, she could see the long gallery lined with portraits, each subject's gaze following her as she passed. She paused before one in particular, a young woman in a pale blue dress, her expression soft but watchful. The plaque beneath it read, Eleanor Dorrance Ashford, 1934-1975. The name Dorrance echoed the phone call she had overheard Lydia make. A faint creak behind her broke the stillness. She turned to see Lydia leaning casually against the doorframe at the end of the hall, a glass of wine in hand. "It's late to be wandering up here," Lydia said, her tone smooth but edged. "These halls have a way of making people imagine things." Celeste offered a neutral smile. "I prefer to think of it as learning the history." Lydia took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving Celeste's. "History is just the version of the past we choose to keep. The rest is inconvenient." She set the glass on a side table and stepped closer, the soft click of her heels carrying across the rug. "Some people don't survive digging up the inconvenient parts." The air between them was taut, each woman holding her ground. Then Lydia's smile returned, thin and deliberate, as she brushed past and descended the stairs without another word. Celeste remained in the gallery, her hand instinctively touching the photograph in her pocket, the weight of it more tangible than ever. She had the sense that the portrait's eyes were still on her, watching, measuring, as though waiting for her to make the next move. Somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed hard enough to shiver the glass in its panes. The slam of the door still echoed faintly in Celeste's mind as she awoke before dawn, the house holding that peculiar stillness that comes just before the staff begins their quiet, efficient work. She slipped from her bed, the cold floorboards drawing a sharp breath from her, and padded toward the window. Down below, in the misty gray of the lawn, a single figure moved along the gravel drive Harriet. clutching what looked like a bundle of papers tight to her chest. It called to mind Harriet's whispered warning from the pantry, the folded photograph still hidden in Celeste's drawer. The connection between Harriet and whatever the photograph represented felt more certain now, though the exact nature of it remained just out of reach. Today, Celeste resolved, she would push further. By mid-morning, the house hummed with restrained activity. Lydia had ordered fresh flowers for the dining room, Sterling was closeted in the study with a man Celeste didn't recognize, and Maxwell was conspicuously absent. The smell of brewing coffee pulled her into the kitchen, where Harriet worked at the far counter, her movements brisk and purposeful. "Out early this morning," Celeste remarked lightly, leaning against the doorway. Harriet's back stiffened just enough to notice. "Some errands can't wait." She turned, meeting Celeste's gaze for a moment before setting a steaming cup before her. "And some questions shouldn't be asked unless you're ready for the answers." Later, in the late morning light slanting through tall windows, Celeste joined Sterling and the unknown man in the study at Sterling's summons. The man introduced himself as Nathaniel Brackett, the family's attorney, his handshake dry and brief. Papers lay spread across the desk, ledgers, contracts, a weathered leather-bound portfolio whose cracked spine suggested decades of use. "We're reviewing the estate's holdings," Sterling said, his tone carefully neutral. "There are matters better understood sooner rather than later." Celeste caught the way Nathaniel's eyes flicked to her and away, a calculation in that glance. She listened as Sterling outlined the expected distribution of assets, the maintenance costs of the property, and the restrictions built into the will. Every word felt like another thread tying her into something larger than she had anticipated. That evening, the family gathered in the drawing room under the pretense of a fireside discussion. Lydia, draped in emerald velvet, sat nearest the fire, her voice smooth as she reminisced about past holiday gatherings. Maxwell arrived late, his coat still dusted with snow, and positioned himself beside the drinks cabinet. Celeste noticed his eyes narrowing whenever Lydia spoke, as though each word of hers carried an unspoken barb. The conversation shifted when Nathaniel joined them, portfolio in hand. "I believe," he said, "it would be wise for all interested parties to understand the stipulations clearly. The late Mr. Ashford's instructions leave little room for interpretation." What followed was less a conversation and more a volley of controlled tensions. Lydia questioned certain provisions with feigned innocence, Sterling dismissed her concerns with clipped authority, and Maxwell, after several glasses of bourbon, let slip a remark about the real reason the old man had structured the will as he had. The room stilled, all eyes on him, but he only smirked and refilled his glass. Celeste watched it all, feeling the undercurrent building toward something sharp and irrevocable. Harriet entered quietly to replenish the firewood, her gaze meeting Celeste's for the briefest second, a glance heavy with meaning. And then she was gone. Hours later, when the house had quieted, Celeste wandered into the library, the scent of aged paper wrapping around her like a familiar shawl. On the desk sat the leather-bound portfolio, left carelessly open to a page of handwritten notes. Her eyes caught on a single line in the margin, penned in a hand she recognized from the photograph's back. "If she ever learns, it will all come undone." The words burned into her thoughts, as tangible as the chill in the air. She traced the ink with her fingertip, feeling the gravity of them. A sudden sound broke her focus, a faint shuffle from the far end of the room. She turned, heart hammering, just in time to see a shadow withdraw behind the heavy drapes. In the end, what remained was not the weight of the estate's walls, nor the value of the paintings, nor the carefully catalogued jewels locked in the vault. What endured was the quiet, bruising truth that no inheritance could heal a wound left untended for decades. The rooms of the house, once echoing with polite laughter, now carried a different kind of sound, low conversations, tentative gestures, the careful beginnings of understanding. Celeste had come seeking clarity about her place in this family, but what she found was the far more difficult knowledge that belonging is not guaranteed by blood, only earned through honesty and care. Sterling learned this as well, though the lesson came to him slowly, through the erosion of the authority he had clung to. His words, once sharp and final, began to soften when he recognized the fracture lines in his siblings were the same as his own. Lydia, for all her composure, could not shield herself from the truth Harriet's revelations had delivered, and she found herself walking the long hallway to Celeste's room late one night, not to win, but to apologize. Maxwell, always the least steady among them, surprised the others with his choice to stay and work alongside Celeste in restoring parts of the estate, a project that demanded patience and stripped away his careless veneer. Harriet's role was more complicated. For years, she had carried the burden of secrets not her own, protecting the house's illusion at the expense of her own peace. In finally speaking, she risked her position, her safety, and the fragile trust she still held with Celeste. Yet, in revealing the truth, she reclaimed her own agency and reshaped the story the family told itself. No longer merely the keeper of rooms and routines, she became a keeper of truth, a role far more enduring. The portfolio's damning line, if she ever learns, "It will all come undone," proved prophetic. When Celeste finally pieced the truth together, the foundation of the Ashford legacy shifted irreversibly. The lies had been built to protect pride, not love, and as they fell, so did the pretense that their unity had ever been complete. The estate's grandeur could not mask the cost of those omissions, the years of missed conversations, the celebrations marred by silent resentment. And yet, in the ashes of that truth, something unexpected began to grow. They did not rush toward reconciliation. No sudden embrace repaired the decades. Instead, they shared breakfasts with fewer silences, allowed disagreements to end without slammed doors, and learned the value of asking questions before assumptions hardened into judgment. The family began, in slow, halting steps, to rebuild not the legend of their name, but the reality of their connection. Celeste understood that her role was no longer to inherit, but to steward the truth, the relationships, and the memory of what had been lost so it would not be lost again. She stayed not out of duty, but choice, finding her own way to honor the family's past without repeating its mistakes. In doing so, she turned the estate from a monument to pride into a home for honesty. Lydia found that letting go of her polished mask did not diminish her. It made her more whole. Sterling saw that leadership without listening is hollow. Maxwell learned that presence, not grand gestures, builds trust. Harriet, having given the truth freely, no longer feared the walls she had once protected. She moved through them as her own person, not the silent guardian of someone else's narrative. The philosophy remains. Family is not preserved by what is hidden, but by what is faced together. Truth is the only legacy that cannot be stolen, altered, or divided. If you have ever believed that facing the truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward real connection, then you understand the heart of this story. If you have lived long enough to know that forgiveness is not a single act, but a lifelong practice, then you see the path they chose. If you like this story, then leave the number 1 in the comments and subscribe to our channel to hear the next story.